Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Dennis Stone, Director of the Center for Advocacy and Social Justice at the Jacksonville Urban League. And this is one of a series of monthly conversations on racial healing and reconciliation. And tonight we have a special guest, Abel Bartley, and he is going to talk about his experience and both as a writer, professor, uh, and as an African American in relative to this topic. We're really grateful for his joining us, and he is a professor of African American and Urban History at Clemson University and director of the Pan-African Studies program. He's author of several essays on race, politics, and the civil rights movement. His new book, In No Ways Tired, tells the story of a Florida community struggle with school integration. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Professor.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to try and keep this as informal as I can, but I'm going to give you a little history, a little background. I sort of centered this on my two books that I've written on Jacksonville. One is on politics, and the other is on school integration. And so I thought I'd center my conversation this evening in those two areas. Talk about a little history about Jacksonville politics and Jacksonville education, and sort of put it into a framework of what we're dealing with today as we deal with the new reality as we have our 47th president in power. Starting a little bit with education. When the Civil War ended in 1865, it is estimated that about 90% of African Americans were illiterate, either functionally illiterate or could not read and write at all. And so you start out with a group of people that only had about 10% of them that were literate, and 90% were illiterate. So once slavery ended, one of the first things that those Reconstruction governments did as we began to elect African Americans to politics, one of the first things they did is they said, we need an education. We need to give our kids a future by setting up a free system of public education. And so every Southern state made it part of their new constitution to establish the notion of free public education. And the federal government helped them in that the federal government made it a requirement for most Southern states for reentering the Union that they approve a new state constitution which ended slavery. And what those new state constitutions also did was they set up a system of free public education. And public education has been, in my humble opinion, the great equalizer in our society because it offers opportunities and chances that other people would not have without education. But when you talk about education, we've been dealing with this situation for quite a long time. Like most things in America during this period and even during the day, racism has sort of tainted how the system worked. In 1867, under President Andrew Johnson, after barely escaping an impeachment vote, he decided not to block the Republican Party's efforts to try and create an interracial democracy. And so what we did is we created the first Department of Education. It started in 1867. and it would last for about a year. And what this Department of Education did was they wanted statistics to find out what kind of education was being offered in each state, what was the quality of that education, what was the training of the teachers, what was the progress being made. And so they put together a system whereby a department whereby they begin to collect statistics and try to coordinate and create an educational system that would guarantee that everyone gained a quality education. Well, unfortunately for them, the timing of this new department was at an unfortunate time because it was right after the Civil War. And a lot of people in the South were not interested in the notion of African Americans getting an education. In fact, for a lot of them, they said that if African Americans got an education, it would destroy the Southern social system and it would destroy the workforce. And so Southern Democrats, and he worked with some Western Republicans and others, to block the implementation of this new Department of Education. And what happened was what started out as a good idea and a good opportunity ended up floundering. And after 9 months, they reduced the leader of this department down. The department started out with only four people. They took two. They cut the director's salary in half. And he said, I can't do it. I can't deal with this. And so he resigned, and we went down to, they just got rid of the Department of Education, and we did not have a Department of Education. So it allowed each state to control their own educational system. Now, that's both a good thing and a bad thing. What a lot of people don't understand is how this country was designed and how it worked. One of the questions I ask my students each semester as I teach my second half of my African American history class is, how did a person get citizenship in the United States before the 14th Amendment? And most people have no idea how you got citizenship before the 14th Amendment. In fact, I'd probably guess that most of you all probably don't know how you got citizenship before the 14th Amendment. Before the 14th Amendment, citizenship was conferred on you by the state. The state would confer citizenship on you. And if the state conferred citizenship on you, that meant that you became a citizen of the United States. Well, for someone who looks like me, that was a problem in the state of Florida or in the state of South Carolina where I live now. Because the state of Florida and the state of South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, Louisiana, those states were not going to confer citizenship on African Americans. And so in 1868, recognizing that, particularly as we began to get the 1866 Civil Rights Act, which was began to put this notion of equality in, they recognized that in order for this thing to work, we had to make African Americans into citizens. And so what they did is they created what was called the 14th Amendment. And what the 14th Amendment basically said is, if you were born or naturalized in the United States, you were a citizen of the United States and subject to all the rights, privileges, and immunities of citizenship. But people read that and don't go farther, because it also said, and you're a citizen of the state you reside in. So it ended that sort of dual citizenship thing, that I'm a citizen of the state, but not a citizen of the United States, or the other way around. If you are a citizen of the United States, you get automatic citizenship in the state you reside in also. And so for African Americans, it took 4 million people who had had no legal definition and no legal status and made them into citizens. It was a tremendously powerful thing, because with that, you get the right to vote, hold property, do all kinds of things that you get with citizenship rights. But the most powerful part of that piece of legislation is, in it, they had what they called the Equal Protection Clause. The Equal Protection Clause protected you, citizens of the United States, against discrimination from the state and originally from private individuals, meaning that the state could not discriminate against you. Unfortunately, our courts betrayed us and betrayed those notions. And by the 1870s, the courts were beginning to redefine what the notion of equal citizenship meant. In a series of court cases that occurred before the United States Supreme Court, they began to limit the notion of equality as it related to your rights as citizens of the state. Ironically, the first case involved a group of butchers in the state of Louisiana. These butchers in Louisiana, there were a bunch of butchers who were butchering meat, and the state became concerned about the quality of the butchers. And so the state picked out several people to be butchers, and the other people that said you can't be butchers. So the state decided they were going to license only a few people as butchers, and the rest they were not going to license. Well, those that were not licensed, they sued the state of Louisiana in court, arguing that that was a clear violation of the Equal Protection Clause. The state cannot pick certain people to be butchers. Everybody had to have the same right. Well, the Supreme Court, in what was called the Slaughterhouse case, said that if it's in the interest, if it's in the public interest, a state can segregate or discriminate against its citizens if it's in the public interest. And so the state of Louisiana can pick certain people to give licenses to for butchers and other people not. But it can't be based on race. And this first case had nothing to do with race. It was just giving the states the opportunity to discriminate if they wanted to. But what that did is it opened Pandora's box. Because by the 1880s, states were beginning to discriminate against African Americans under the color of law. Several states began to pass legislation separating African Americans on public transportation system. Other states began to pass laws making it illegal for African Americans and whites to marry. Other states began to pass laws doing other things. And so they slowly began this process of segregating African Americans, so much so that by 1888, the state of Mississippi passed a law in which they said every railroad company has to provide a first-class car for African Americans. Now, why would the state of Mississippi pass a law saying every railroad had to provide a first-class car for African Americans? Well, the reason they did that was because they were not supplying a first-class car for African Americans. African Americans, at this time, there were 3 tickets that you could buy to ride on the train: first class, women's car, or the smoking car. And African Americans, even if you didn't smoke, were relegated often to the smoking car because they made a high bar for people to get first class status, first class tickets if you were African American. So a group of African Americans sued, making the argument that they were being discriminated against, that you cannot provide first class accommodations for whites and not provide for African Americans. That's a clear violation of the Equal Protection Clause. Well, the Supreme Court used a very strange slogan in 1888 in a case in which they said you can separate African Americans as long as you provide equal accommodations. And they set the standard up for something they call separate but equal. By 1896, this was beginning to become a serious issue in the United States. And so in the state of Louisiana, in Louisiana, they have a strange racial hierarchy. They have blacks, they have whites, and in the middle, they have Creoles. In 1811, in the state of Louisiana, there was a slave rebellion in New Orleans. It was one of the worst slave rebellions in America. During the slave rebellion, the Creoles joined side with the whites to help put down the slave rebellion. As a result, Creoles got special status in Louisiana, and they were not defined legally as Black. After the Civil War, as we began to institute separate but equal, the line of demarcation between Black and whites disappeared. And so there was no room in the middle between Black and white. America developed a strange concept that no one else in the entire world has ever used or will ever use, I suspect, something that they called the one drop rule. If you had one drop of African blood in you, then you were defined as Black. Even when the Nazis put together their racial program, you had to have 1/8 blood of Jewish blood to be considered a Jew. In America, 1 drop of Black blood made you an African American, which meant that agreement that they had with the Creoles then was out. So the Creoles sued, challenging this law, this whole idea of segregation. And their argument was, we are not Black. You're treating us as if we're Black, we're not Black. And so they got a Creole man by the name of Homer Plessy, who was 1/8 Black, an octoroon. He bought a ticket traveling from one city in Louisiana to another city in Louisiana. And when the conductor saw him, the conductor didn't even know he was Black. He had to tell the conductor, I'm Black. The conductor told him, you cannot sit in that seat then. And so as a result, he was arrested and he challenged Louisiana's law segregating African Americans. They hired what was considered one of the best African American lawyers in the country, a Creole himself, a man by the name of Albion Truget, to argue in the Supreme Court. And the case went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. And Truget argued that separating African Americans just simply because they were Black was a clear violation of the Equal Protection Clause and made being Black a crime. In a stunning 8-0 decision, though, the United States Supreme Court ruled that just simply separating African Americans did not stigmatize them and did not set them up for unequal treatment as long as the accommodations were equal. It was a clear violation of what the writers, John Bingham, when he wrote the 14th Amendment, what he was saying, because the whole point was Blacks are equal and you cannot treat them any different from anyone else. But the Supreme Court did not allow that. And so in 1896, in the Plessy v. Ferguson case, the Supreme Court ruled that states could discriminate against African Americans. They could separate African Americans as long as the accommodations were equal. And so all over the South, you have this elaborate set of laws separating African Americans from whites on all social venues. 1899, little town in Cummings, Georgia. A woman by the name of Lucy Craft Laney has a school in Cummings, Georgia. It's a high school. There are 2 high schools in Cummings, Georgia, Lucy Craft Laney School, and then afterwards, the whites in Cummings opened their own high school. So there's 2 high schools. When Georgia passed this law segregating people in the state of Georgia, they said, look, we don't have enough money to have 2 high schools. And so they did a, quote, investigation to figure out which school to close. And after this investigation, they chose to close Lucy Craft Laney School. Even though the school had more students, even though the school was old, had been in service for longer, and even though the school was larger, they closed Lucy Craft Laney School, which was the Black school, and kept the white high school open. Lucy Craft Laney sued, arguing that this was a clear violation of the Equal Protection Clause. But her remedy was controversial. The remedy that her lawyer asked for was, if you're going to close the Black school, if you're going to have equal, separate but equal, if there's no Black high school, then you have to close the white high school also. And so the United States Supreme Court ruled that when it came to the notion of separate but equal, separate was more important than equal. And that's Cummings v. Georgia, 1899. And so with those 2 cases, the state gets the right to discriminate against African Americans and separate African Americans. And from there, you have this long history then of state-sponsored discrimination backed up by not only state law, de jure segregation by law, but also customs that set an etiquette of how people react and how people behave in the South. The result was, as segregation began to spread, the society became more and more unequal as African Americans found themselves locked out of opportunities, out of jobs, and forced to accept a second-class education. What is remarkable, though, is even though African Americans were locked in second-class status and second-class schools, they were able to train a cadre of leaders who came up and challenged the system. They had remarkable teachers who instilled in them a sense of pride and a sense of belongingness that allowed them to fight back against the worst charges of unfair charges and unfair treatment, and allowed these people, allowed African Americans to fight the system. So much so that African Americans were able to train lawyers, doctors, teachers, preachers, inventors, engineers. When you look at the list of African Americans who were trained in these separate and desperately unequal schools, and the amount of things that they were able to do, it is a remarkable thing that they were able to do, these African Americans. I'm just going to talk about a couple of them. George Washington Carver. George Washington Carver was probably one of the most impressive scientists of the 20th century. George Washington Carver, in 1915, a little bug came to the United States from Mexico. This bug was called the boll weevil. And the boll weevil ate the cotton crop 3 years in a row. At the time, people were doing what they call sharecropping or tenant farming. And the way it worked is you work somebody's land, and at the end of the year, you harvest the crop, you sold the crop, and then you split the proceeds. Well, if the boll weevil eats the cotton crop, that means that you are in debt, and then you go back into debt next year. Then the boll weevil ate the crop that year. So 3 years in a row, the boll weevil had eaten the crop and put the entire South in debt. A group of white farmers came to Tuskegee, went to Tuskegee, and they talked to Mr. Carver. They said, look, we're going bankrupt. What can we do to save agriculture in the South? Carver suggested that they plow under their cotton and grow peanuts. First, they said peanuts. Nobody eats peanuts. In fact, what people used peanuts to do was to feed hogs, to fatten them up. And so Carver said, tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to create a market for peanuts. And he went into his lab and he invented more than 150 products that could be made from peanuts. And he literally created a market for peanuts. Those 4 of those 5 farmers who plowed under their cotton and grew peanuts became millionaires within a year and a half. Because they followed George Washington Carver's idea, and they began to grow peanuts. Now, I know some of you probably thinking, well, I don't know if that story is true. Well, you can test it out yourself. You go to a little town called Bessemer, Alabama. In downtown Bessemer, Alabama, they have a monument that they built. Or go to downtown Enterprise, Alabama. There's a monument that they built. And this monument is a monument to the boll weevil. They thank the boll weevil for destroying the cotton crop, because the boll weevil destroyed the cotton crop, they started growing peanuts, and they made millions of dollars, and the town came back to life. They don't mention George Washington Carver's name on any of those monuments. But what you know when you study history is the only reason they grew peanuts and the only reason those peanuts became profitable is because of what George Washington Carver did. Our former president, Jimmy Carter, died a few weeks ago. Carter's family became millionaires off of peanuts. And if you read Bart Carter's books, he gives credit to George Washington Carver because George Washington Carver created the peanut market, which literally saved agriculture in the South. Not only that, he encouraged them to grow sweet potatoes because sweet potatoes replenish the soil. But they said if we grow sweet potatoes, there's not a market for it. He went into his lab and came up with 150 different products that could be made from the sweet potato. He did the same thing for the white potato. In fact, during World War II, the United States had a serious problem. We could not get rubber, latex, and we needed latex to make tires for our Jeeps and our trucks during World War II. And we were having a serious problem because the German submarines were sinking our ships that were bringing our latex to us from Liberia. And so President Franklin Roosevelt called George Washington Carver up to Washington, D.C., and he says, Mr. Carver, we have a problem. We cannot get enough latex, and we really need latex to make tires for our cars, for our Jeeps and for our trucks for the war effort. Is there anything you can do? Carver said, give me a couple of weeks. He went into his lab down in Tuskegee, and he figured out a way to make synthetic latex from sweet potatoes. And during World War II, we made tires out of sweet potatoes as a result of George Washington Carver's inventiveness. It's something that he won a medal for during the war because Roosevelt was so impressed, and it helped us win the war effort. Carver was educated in one of those schools, and he even taught in one of those schools, Tuskegee's. There were numerous other African Americans who were taught in those schools. The first open heart surgery, of course, Daniel Hale Williams. Everyone believed that you could not operate on the chest cavity of the heart if you open the chest cavity. There's a man who had been stabbed in the heart. Everybody, under normal circumstances, you let him die because you can't operate on an open heart. Well, he decided to test the theory. He pulled the knife out, he sutured it, and he was the first person to successfully complete an open heart surgery. But my point that I'm making is even under segregation, African Americans demonstrated a tremendous amount of ability, even in those schools that were second-class schools, and they were able to solve problems that other people had not even thought about. Anytime you get on a roller coaster, you need to think Granville T. Woods. Granville T. Woods is the man who came up with the idea of roller coasters. And think of what the state of Florida would be like without roller coasters, where Disneyland and all those and those places are. Not only that, he's the one who helped us come up with a better braking system for trains. Lewis Latimer, When you talk about the light, the incandescent light, Lewis Latimer is the guy who actually made the first one that worked, not Thomas Edison. He worked for Edison. So my point was African Americans were figuring out a way to make it work even through their second-class citizenship. But what really changes us, though, is World War II. During World War II, we send almost 20 million people to Europe to fight against Nazi Germany. And more than 2 million of them are African Americans. They go and they're fighting the maniacal madness of racism in Nazi Germany. And then they return to the United States and they face the same kind of maniacal racism. And so those soldiers who fought against the Germans come back with a new attitude, and they begin to push the federal government to equalize our society. America looks like a big hypocrite in that we're going around the world telling people about justice and equality and democracy, and we're on one hand, while on the other hand, we're denying it to a lot of our own citizens. And so what starts out as a small movement grows into a massive civil rights movement that begins to affect all parts of our society. One of the big areas was education. beginning in 1935, African Americans began to challenge the dual pay scale that was used in public schools for teachers. Black teachers generally earned half of what white teachers earned during the 1930s. And so two NAACP lawyers, Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall, began to challenge the dual pay scale utilized in most school districts. And they argued the notion of separate but equal, that there is no rational reason to pay a white teacher twice what you pay an African American teacher. And the result was they were able to force almost every Southern school district to create a single pay scale for Black and white teachers. Now, what the school districts did was they came up with other schemes to underpay African Americans, but they got the notion that the federal government would enforce the notion of separate but equal. Then, 1947, African Americans began to challenge the idea that African Americans could not attend graduate programs in Southern states. A number of African Americans applied for admittance into Southern graduate programs. Now, before this period, before the 1940s, really mid-1940s and early 1950s, if you were an African American and if you could prove that you could do graduate work, the state would pay you to go outside of the state of Florida to a graduate program so that you wouldn't integrate their schools. Well, after World War II, with the GI Bill, African Americans began to challenge that system, and they said, look, I want my graduate degree in the state where I pay taxes. And they began to challenge this notion, and the result was the Supreme Court began to declare these out-of-state tuitions a violation of the Equal Protection Clause and forced graduate programs to open up to African Americans. Southerners began to see the handwriting on the wall, and they began a process of equalizing education. The problem was it was too little, too late. And so, in a little town in South Carolina, a group of parents asked for a bus. Now, what happened was you had African American kids who were walking 10 to 12 miles a day because the school did not supply them with transportation. Meanwhile, the school had more than 100 buses for white kids and no bus for African Americans. The African American community had a fish fry and sold apples and other stuff and raised money and was able to buy their own bus. When that bus broke down, they asked the school district, will you give us money to fix the bus? They said no. Well, will you let us use one of the buses? School district had 20 buses that they kept in reserve. And they said, can we use one of your buses to transport our children? They said no. So those African American parents sued. And the first case challenging school segregation starts in the state of South Carolina, a case called Briggs v. Elliott, as they're suing over a bus. Later, several other students in other areas sue, one of which in Topeka, Kansas, a young girl whose father, the schools are basically equal, but her father has to go past a white school to take his daughter to a Black school. And he said, that makes no sense. Why can't she just go to the school closest to her? And so then there are kids in Washington, D.C. who sue over the schools being segregated and the Black schools being totally unequal. And then there are two other cases. And so the cases come before the United States Supreme Court. And in 1954, the United States Supreme Court rules that separate but equal is a clear violation of the Equal Protection Clause. And they outlaw it. And so segregation is torn down. And so what you did have is this process now of integrating the schools that is still going on today. All right, it's still going on. In 1955, the NAACP took the school districts back to court in what was called Brown 2. And in May of 1955, Supreme Court had to reiterate that school districts have to begin the process of integrating their schools. So what begins then is this long process of creating an equal society. And in Jacksonville, I'm going to go from the macro now to the macro and talk about Jacksonville. In Jacksonville, this played out during the 1950s and 1960s as you had a number of African Americans who began to challenge the unequal society in Jacksonville. Ernest Jackson was a lawyer who did civil rights cases, and he filed several cases on behalf of an African American policeman, one of the first Black African American policemen, a man by the name of Frank Hampton, who challenged segregation in the city parks. Hampton was an avid golfer, and at the time, African Americans were allowed to use the city park 2 or 3 days a week. Well, he challenged that and said that this was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. If he paid taxes, he should have same access to the to the parks and golf courses as whites. And so he filed a series of lawsuits challenging segregation and discrimination on Jacksonville's city parks. The city actually closed the parks for a while to halt them from being integrated. When you talk about someone being a civil rights fighter and really pushing the notion of equality in the city of Jacksonville, one name really stands out, and that's Rutledge Pearson. Rutledge Pearson was a school teacher, but before that, he was a baseball player who played in the old Negro League. He would have been the first African American to integrate the minor league baseball in the state of Florida, had it not been for the fact that Hayden Burns and the city council decided to close the ballpark to keep him from integrating the minor leagues. This made him a fierce opponent of segregation. He became a school teacher. He became a baseball coach, and he eventually became the president of the Florida and Jacksonville branches of the NAACP. He was a fearless leader. He had his classes, he taught history and civics, and he always instilled in his students the notion of what their rights were and this idea that they needed to fight for their rights. Not only that, his baseball teams won several state championships. Not only that, he was a fighter for civil rights. Leading the NAACP fight in the state of Florida for civil rights was not an easy thing to do for a guy who worked as a school teacher. But he was smart in that he created a youth division, and he got the youth to participate in protests, keeping his fingerprints off of most of the protests so that the school district could not retaliate against him. And the result was he was able to push integration in the state of in the city of Jacksonville. In 1960, there was a riot as he led a series of sit-ins. As a result of these sit-ins, he was able to integrate downtown lunch counters. By 1964, he was again leading protests in Jacksonville, and he was able to get Jacksonville to integrate most of their downtown areas and end most of the segregation. These are just some of the people. Then you had people like Earl Johnson. Earl Johnson was a lawyer who filed most of the school integration cases in the state of Florida. He worked for the NAACP. In fact, when Martin Luther King was arrested in St. Augustine, it was Earl Johnson who went to St. Augustine and defended him and worked out a deal where Martin Luther King was taken out of jail in St. Augustine and brought to Jacksonville because there was fear he might be killed in St. Augustine. Earl Johnson would eventually run for city council. He would be a leading figure in city-county consolidation and would rally the support of the Black community to get city-county consolidation, creating the largest city in the United States. He eventually ran for, like I said, city council, and he became the first African-American to be president of the city council. And he was in line to be the first African-American mayor, but a series of unfortunate things happened. And then when you also talk about Jacksonville, Don Gaffney was a quarterback at Raines High School who went on to the University of Florida and became one of the first African-Americans to quarterback a predominantly white school in the South when he quarterbacked the University of Florida. And he actually took them to a 9-3 record and did a very good job and broke down a lot of stereotypes about African American quarterbacks. There are a number of African Americans who did incredible stuff. Eartha White, Eartha White Mission. Eartha White was one of the first African American women to be a millionaire in the city of Jacksonville. The Eartha White Mission did a tremendous job of fighting for civil rights. Then you had Abraham Lincoln Lewis. Abraham Lincoln Lewis was the founder of the Afro-American Life Insurance Company. He's the first African American in the state of Florida to have a salary of $1 million a year. He opened a Black resort called American Beach, which was a resort for African Americans. So my point is, despite all of the opposition and all of the things that African Americans went through, they were able to carve out an existence in the city of Jacksonville and in the United States, despite their discrimination, and they continued to fight and continue to fight for equality. What we're dealing with now with this attack on DEI and all that is an attempt to erase our past. And it's really tragic that what is going on, but I really believe that they're going to be unsuccessful because, as usual, African Americans have figured out a way to always find a way to not only survive, but to thrive no matter what the situation is. And I have run afoul of time. I said I'd leave time for questions. And so I'm going to open it up now.
Thank you very much. That was a really, I could tell, heartfelt and quite stunning recount of history, the history of segregation, and the courage of people that you've mentioned. I think of Virgil Hawkins, who was denied access to law school.
Yes.
And eventually became a lawyer, and then they trumped up ways to get him disbarred. I mean, it's just. Anyway, questions for Dr. Bartley? I have a question. This is in the weeds from where you started. Why do you suppose all those white scientists couldn't have come up with a few good ideas themselves relative to the cotton crop?
That is a question that a lot of students ask. You know, one of the things when you don't have access to a lot of things, you learn to be inventive.
Yeah.
And so you look at things from a different perspective. And I think that that's one of the things that George Washington Carver was tutored by one of the top agricultural scientists, German agricultural scientists. And one of the things that he was taught was how to look at things from a different perspective. And the South was so dedicated to the cotton crop. All they could think about was, how can I get more cotton? How can I get more cotton? And the idea of diversifying their agriculture, something that George Washington Carver had been talking about for years, didn't occur to them. Cotton was destroying the South's soil, but they were so dedicated to it. If you look at it, one of the crazy things when you study history is why the South was so addicted to cotton. After if you look at cotton prices, really after the early 1900s, they don't really go up much. And so you're producing more and more cotton, but the price of cotton is not going up. And the main reason is because Egypt and other places, India and other places, are growing cotton, and there's a glut of cotton. Mm-hmm. And so we're growing more and more cotton, but the price is going less and less and less. And so Southern agriculture is getting deeper and deeper into debt. And that's what George Washington Carver could see. And several other Black scientists could see it. Said, let's try something else, something that other people aren't growing. I hope that answers your question.
That was great. Yeah, no, well, so, and just so also what you're saying is he, like so many other African Americans, wouldn't take no for an answer. I mean, they knew that they had to work it out.
Right.
Somebody else had a question?
Dr. Bartley, this is Charlene Taylor Hill.
Yes.
Wanted to find out just what part of the school system did you go through here in Jacksonville? And you mentioned early on in your talk that things are pretty much the same or going back to what it used to be. So what's your prediction of what's going to happen?
All right. First, I grew up in the Arlington area, and so I came up after integration, right as integration was going on. So I went to Parkwood Elementary, and then I went to Susie Talbert. We were bused at Susie Talbert, and then to Douglas Anderson, and then I went to what's now called Arlington Middle School, and then I went to Terry Parker. So that's
okay. So you're way behind me.
Yeah.
I was in school when when Rutledge Pearson was an instructor still.
Oh, okay, yes.
Yeah.
And now, what I see happening now is really a tragedy. I mean, this whole I was just had class this morning with my students, and I said we really have not since the early 1900s been in a situation where people were so dedicated to voting against their own interests. What has happened now is there's this worldwide movement towards oligarchies and authoritarianism that people are willing to give up their hard-earned rights over this perceived notion that they're losing something by sharing what they have. And I see this going on because when you look at the last election, there is no rational reason for the groups that voted for the president to have voted for the president if they were actually looking at what he was saying and what he was offering. And what it is that I think people are at this point where they're at this inflection point where they're saying that if my elevation means the elevation of others, I'd rather not be elevated myself. And it's this crazy notion, but it is a notion that we're saying. So now we have this attack, this rewriting of history. The Nazis, when Hitler took over Nazi Germany, he rewrote German history. And one of the craziest things he did, I really encourage everybody, if you get a chance, watch the movie Bonhoeffer. Because Hitler rewrote the Bible and rewrote Christianity, the history of Christianity. And he took Jews out and replaced them with Nazis, with Aryans. And even though most people knew it wasn't true, they went along with it. Well, what we see today is an attempt to rewrite history and write African Americans out, write women out, write people who are gendered out. And it every time there's an attempt to do this, the communists did it, the Chinese did it, truth has a way of bouncing back and coming back. And so we're in this cycle now where there's this attempt to rewrite history. Some of the laws that have been passed are so crazy that they make no sense. You're going to arrest professors for telling the truth. You're going to, for years, African-American kids were sitting in classes where they were subjected to really uncomfortable lectures and conversations, and nobody cared. But now all of a sudden we care about uncomfortable conversations that our kids are exposed to. It really doesn't make any sense to me. And so I see these things, it's a pendulum. Right now we're swinging way to one side, but I think there's going to be a correction and we're going to come back. My hope is that we do the correction before it's too late. That is my humble opinion. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I remember a mentor of mine some years ago said that the pendulum always swings to one extreme or the other, but it settles back. I just hope it settles back quickly.
Dr. King says the moral arc, it's long, but it bends towards the right. And so, yeah, I don't, we're in a moment right now, but this is an international, all over the world, people are doing this. There's, attack on brown and black people all over the world, but I agree with you that it's a moment. And now I don't think we should, I think, we don't need to become fascinated with the symptom, because the symptom is Donald Trump, but he's not the disease. The disease is there's a group of people who are dedicated to trying to keep the society from moving forward and progressing. And that's the real disease. And that's what we need to really be concerned about.
I think we have time for one last question. Well,
I didn't have a question. I just wanted to say thank you for speaking to us.
Oh, thank you, Princess Duncan.
Yes.
Are you a student, Princess?
yes, she is one of our interns.
Ah, okay. Yeah, good.
Princess, did you want to introduce yourself?
Okay. My name's Princess Duncan. I'm a senior at Florida A&M University, and I'm studying health, leisure, fitness, and I'm graduating in May. And my career goals are to own a nonprofit that has prosthetics to give to people so they can have prosthetics that are at affordable price using 3D printers and AI and stuff like that.
Oh, all right, a rattler. Okay, I taught at FAMU for 5 years.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, you might know Reginald Ellis. He's a former student of mine. He's worked in the history department. In fact, he's the dean of the graduate student now, I think.
His last name does sound familiar.
All right, a rattler. My wife is a FAMU graduate.
Yes,
Nice
I've enjoyed my time here.
All right.
Well, I wanted to thank you, Dr. Bartley, on behalf of the Jacksonville Urban League for spending time with us this evening. We're very grateful, and also on behalf of the interns that made this possible, we thank you very much, and we wish you the best of luck and hope to have you back again to share perhaps some more history that takes place between now and when we have you back.
All right, we'll be glad to. I enjoyed this opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us also.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.